October 15, 1946. Buckinghamshire, England. German prisoners of war, men who had fought against Britain just months earlier, stood in academic robes receiving university diplomas from British officials. The scene defied every convention of warfare and captivity. These weren't broken men shuffling through prison yards, but educated graduates shaking hands with their former enemies, clutching certificates that would reshape their futures and ultimately the future of Germany itself. This extraordinary moment represented the culmination of one of history's most audacious experiments in human transformation. While the world focused on Nuremberg trials and denazification through punishment, Britain had chosen a radically different path. They believed that defeating Nazi Germany required more than military victory. It demanded winning the battle for German minds and souls through education, debate, and intellectual awakening. The story begins not with grand strategy, but with a simple recognition among British intellectuals and policymakers. Military conquest could destroy the Nazi war machine, but it couldn't erase the ideological poison that had infected an entire generation of Germans. To build lasting peace, Britain would need to transform enemies into democratic allies. The tool they chose was unprecedented, turning prisoner of war camps into universities. By 1944, Britain held over 400,000 German and Italian prisoners scattered across camps throughout England, Scotland, and Wales. These men represented a cross-section of German society: farmers and factory workers, teachers and engineers, clerks and professors. Many had been indoctrinated by Nazi ideology from childhood. Others had served reluctantly, swept along by circumstances beyond their control. All found themselves in a country they had been taught to despise, facing an uncertain future in the hands of enemies they expected to show no mercy. The British approach to these prisoners reflected deep philosophical convictions about human nature and the possibility of redemption. Leading figures in the Foreign Office, including men like Yvonne Kirkpatrick and Robert van Sittart, argued that Germany's future depended not on punishment, but on re-education. They drew inspiration from liberal educational theory, believing that exposure to democratic ideas and critical thinking could cure the authoritarian mindset that had made Nazism possible. This wasn't naive idealism. British planners understood that post-war Germany would need leaders who understood democracy, not just men who had been beaten into submission. The prisoner of war population represented a unique opportunity, a captive audience of future German citizens who could be systematically exposed to democratic values and liberal thought. If successful, these men could return to Germany as seeds of democratic transformation. The philosophical foundation for this approach emerged from Britain's own democratic traditions and wartime experience. Unlike totalitarian regimes that sought to crush opposition through terror, British democracy had always relied on persuasion, debate, and the gradual evolution of ideas. The challenge was applying these principles to men who had been raised under a system that rejected such values entirely. Winston Churchill himself, despite his reputation as a warrior, endorsed the educational approach. He understood that military victory alone would leave Germany as a resentful, potentially dangerous neighbor. Only by winning German hearts and minds could Britain ensure lasting peace in Europe. This strategic vision required patience, resources, and an unwavering faith in the power of education to transform even the most committed enemies. The most ambitious manifestation of this philosophy emerged at Wilton Park, a stately mansion in Buckinghamshire that had been requisitioned for the war effort. In January 1946, this elegant country house was transformed into something unprecedented, an anti-Nazi university designed specifically for German prisoners of war. The man chosen to lead this experiment was Heinz Küppler, a German Jewish refugee who had fled Nazi persecution and found sanctuary in Britain. Küppler's personal story embodied the moral complexity of the entire program. As a Jew who had lost family members to Nazi persecution, he might have been expected to harbor deep hatred for German soldiers. Instead, he channeled his pain into a mission of redemption, believing that education could cure the disease of anti-Semitism and authoritarianism that had infected his homeland. His appointment sent a powerful message. Victims of Nazi ideology would lead the effort to heal their former persecutors. The selection process for Wilton Park was rigorous and strategic. British intelligence officers identified prisoners who showed intellectual curiosity, leadership potential, or skepticism toward Nazi ideology. They sought men who might become influential in post-war Germany: teachers, journalists, civil servants, and potential political leaders. These carefully chosen individuals would spend months at Wilton Park, engaging with ideas that challenged everything they had been taught about democracy, liberalism, and the nature of civilized society. The physical transformation of Wilton Park symbolized the broader transformation Britain hoped to achieve. The mansion's grand rooms became lecture halls, where former enemies debated the principles of parliamentary democracy. Its libraries filled with works on political philosophy, economics, and constitutional law that had been banned in Nazi Germany. Most remarkably, the barbed wire was removed, the guard towers dismantled, and the atmosphere transformed from that of a prison to that of an elite academic institution. The curriculum at Wilton Park was comprehensive and intellectually demanding. Prisoners attended lectures by distinguished academics, many of them German refugees who had fled Nazi persecution. They studied the British parliamentary system, American federalism, and the principles underlying liberal democracy. The irony was profound. Jewish intellectuals who had been driven from German universities by Nazi policies now returned as teachers, offering their former countrymen the education they had been denied. Daily life at Wilton Park deliberately blurred the lines between captivity and education. Prisoners wore civilian clothes rather than uniforms. They participated in seminars where vigorous debate was encouraged, not suppressed. They had access to newspapers, books, and radio broadcasts that provided uncensored information about the war and its aftermath. Most importantly, they were treated as intellectual equals, not as defeated enemies, fostering an atmosphere of mutual respect that made genuine learning possible. The transformation process was gradual and often painful. Many prisoners arrived at Wilton Park, convinced that democracy was weak, that liberalism was decadent, and that authoritarian government was natural and necessary. Through months of study, debate, and exposure to democratic ideas, these convictions slowly crumbled. Prisoners began to question not just Nazi ideology, but the fundamental assumptions about power, authority, and human nature that had made their acceptance of Nazism possible. The psychological impact of this educational approach extended far beyond formal coursework. For the first time in their adult lives, many prisoners experienced an environment where questions were welcomed rather than punished, where dissent was encouraged rather than suppressed, and where intellectual exploration was valued rather than feared. This experiential education in democratic values proved as powerful as any lecture or seminar. One prisoner, a former Wehrmacht officer, later described his experience at Wilton Park as an intellectual awakening that shattered his worldview. He had arrived convinced that Germany's defeat proved the superiority of force over ideas. Through months of study and discussion, he came to understand that Germany's defeat actually demonstrated the ultimate weakness of systems based on coercion rather than consent. This realization would shape his post-war career as a journalist and advocate for democratic values in Germany. While Wilton Park represented the elite end of British re-education efforts, the emphasis on learning spread throughout the POW camp system. At camps across Britain, prisoners organized their own educational programs, creating what became known as barbed wire universities. These grassroots institutions demonstrated that the hunger for learning and intellectual growth transcended the artificial boundaries of captivity. The emergence of these prisoner-organized universities reflected both practical necessity and genuine intellectual curiosity. Many POWs were highly educated professionals whose skills were atrophying in captivity. Others were young men whose education had been interrupted by military service. The camp universities provided opportunities for both groups to continue their intellectual development, despite the constraints of imprisonment. British authorities initially viewed these prisoner-organized educational programs with suspicion, fearing they might be used to maintain Nazi ideology or plan escapes. However, careful monitoring revealed that the opposite was occurring. The educational programs were fostering critical thinking, democratic values, and intellectual independence. Rather than reinforcing Nazi beliefs, they were systematically undermining them through exposure to alternative ideas and ways of thinking. The success of these educational programs created complex moral and political questions for British society. While prisoners studied philosophy and earned degrees, British families mourned sons killed by German weapons. taxpayer money-funded libraries and laboratories for men who had recently been enemies. Critics argued that Britain was rewarding those who had fought against democracy, while their own citizens faced continued rationing and hardship. These criticisms reflected genuine moral complexity that divided British public opinion. Conservative voices in Parliament questioned whether resources should be devoted to educating enemies when British veterans struggled to find work and housing. They argued that the re-education programs represented misguided idealism that ignored the reality of German war crimes and the suffering of British civilians during the Blitz. Liberal supporters of the programs countered that they served Britain's long-term interests more effectively than punishment or neglect. A democratic Germany would require democratic leaders, and the POW camps provided an opportunity to train such leaders under controlled conditions. Moreover, prisoners who experienced British fairness and democratic values firsthand would become advocates for cooperation rather than revenge when they returned to Germany. The debate extended beyond practical considerations to fundamental questions about human nature and the possibility of redemption. Could men who had fought for an evil regime be genuinely transformed through education? Was it possible to separate individual soldiers from the ideology they had served? These philosophical questions had no easy answers, but they forced British society to confront its own values and beliefs about justice, mercy, and the possibility of human change. The prisoners themselves displayed varying responses to their educational opportunities. Some embraced learning with genuine enthusiasm, recognizing that education offered hope for meaningful futures in post-war Germany. These men threw themselves into their studies with the dedication of traditional university students, attending lectures, participating in discussions, and completing assignments with remarkable seriousness given their circumstances. Others participated reluctantly, viewing cooperation as necessary for survival, but maintaining private skepticism about democratic values. They attended classes and completed coursework, but their engagement remained superficial. For these prisoners, education was a means to an end rather than a genuine intellectual journey. Their transformation, if it occurred at all, was pragmatic rather than philosophical. A minority actively resisted re-education efforts, clinging to Nazi ideology despite exposure to alternative ideas. These prisoners attended mandatory sessions, but rejected the fundamental premises of democratic education. They maintained their commitment to authoritarian values and their belief in German racial superiority. For them, the educational programs represented enemy propaganda to be endured, rather than wisdom to be absorbed. These different responses reflected the complex motivations and backgrounds of the prisoner population. Younger prisoners, who had been more thoroughly indoctrinated by Nazi education, often proved more resistant to change than older men who remembered pre-Nazi Germany. Educated prisoners were more likely to engage seriously with democratic ideas, while those with limited education sometimes struggled to grasp abstract political concepts. The most successful transformations occurred among prisoners who had harbored private doubts about Nazi ideology, even before capture. For these men, the educational programs provided intellectual frameworks for understanding their dissatisfaction with authoritarianism and articulating alternative visions of political organization. They became the most effective advocates for democratic values among their fellow prisoners. As the war ended and repatriation began, the results of Britain's educational experiment became visible. Thousands of German prisoners returned home carrying not just memories of fair treatment, but formal educational credentials and exposure to democratic ideas. Many had learned English, studied British and American political systems, and developed personal relationships with British civilians and officials. The repatriation process itself became part of the educational experience. Rather than simply shipping prisoners back to Germany, British authorities organized systematic debriefings that reinforced democratic lessons and provided guidance for life in post-war Germany. Prisoners received certificates documenting their educational achievements, letters of recommendation from British instructors, and practical advice about rebuilding their lives in a democratic society. The graduation ceremonies that marked the completion of educational programs were emotionally complex events. Former enemies shook hands as teachers and students, acknowledging shared intellectual achievements that transcended national boundaries. British officials who had initially viewed the prisoners as dangerous enemies now saw them as potential partners in building a peaceful Europe. Prisoners who had expected brutality and revenge instead experienced respect and opportunity. These ceremonies represented more than individual achievement. They symbolized the possibility of transformation through education and mutual understanding. The academic robes worn by German prisoners in British camps became powerful symbols of redemption and renewal, demonstrating that even the deepest enmities could be overcome through patient effort and genuine commitment to human dignity. The long-term impact of Britain's POW education programs became evident in the decades following the war. Many former prisoners used their educational credentials to build successful careers in the new German Federal Republic. They became teachers, journalists, civil servants, and business leaders, carrying democratic values into influential positions throughout German society. Some former prisoners achieved remarkable prominence in post-war Germany. They served in the Bundestag, led major corporations, and contributed to the intellectual and cultural reconstruction of their country. Their experiences in British camps had provided not just education, but a living demonstration of how democratic societies could function effectively and humanely. The influence of these educated former prisoners extended beyond their individual careers. They became advocates for democratic values, Atlantic cooperation, and European integration. Their first-hand experience of British democracy made them effective ambassadors for Western values during the Cold War period, when Germany's orientation between East and West remained uncertain. Research conducted decades later revealed the lasting impact of the re-education programs on participants' political attitudes and behavior. Former prisoners who had attended educational programs were significantly more likely to support democratic parties, favor European integration, and maintain positive attitudes toward Britain and the United States. The programs had succeeded in creating a generation of German leaders committed to democratic values and international cooperation. However, the legacy of the POW education programs remained controversial in Germany itself. Some Germans viewed the former prisoners as collaborators who had been corrupted by enemy propaganda. Others saw them as pragmatists who had made the best of difficult circumstances. The complexity of these reactions reflected broader German struggles to come to terms with the Nazi past and build new national identities based on democratic values. The British experiment in POW education also influenced international thinking about post-conflict reconstruction and reconciliation. The success of transforming enemies into allies through education, rather than punishment, provided a model for later efforts to build peace after civil wars and international conflicts. The programs demonstrated that even deeply held ideological commitments could be changed through patient educational effort and genuine respect for human dignity. Modern scholars have debated the ultimate significance of Britain's POW education programs. Some argue that they played a crucial role in Germany's successful transition to democracy by creating a cadre of democratically educated leaders. Others contend that broader social and economic forces were more important in shaping post-war German development. Most agree that the programs represented a remarkable experiment in human transformation that challenged conventional assumptions about the nature of enmity and the possibility of redemption. The story of German prisoners earning degrees in British camps ultimately transcends the specific historical circumstances of World War II. It speaks to fundamental questions about human nature, the power of education, and the possibility of transforming conflict into cooperation. The British decision to give books rather than beatings to their enemies reflected a profound faith in the human capacity for growth and change. This faith was not always rewarded. Some prisoners remained committed to authoritarian values despite years of democratic education. Others embraced democratic rhetoric while maintaining private reservations about liberal values. The transformation process was incomplete, uneven, and sometimes superficial. Yet for thousands of individuals, the experience of learning in captivity opened new possibilities for understanding themselves, their society, and their place in the world. The academic robes worn by German prisoners in 1946 represented more than individual achievement or successful re-education. They symbolized the triumph of hope over hatred, of education over indoctrination, and of human dignity over the dehumanizing forces of war. In choosing to treat their enemies as potential students rather than permanent adversaries, the British demonstrated that even the most bitter conflicts could be transformed through patience, wisdom, and an unwavering commitment to the better angels of human nature. The legacy of this remarkable experiment continues to resonate today, reminding us that the most lasting victories are won not on battlefields but in classrooms, not through force, but through the patient work of education and understanding. In a world still torn by conflict and division, the story of books triumphing over beatings offers both inspiration and practical guidance for those who seek to build bridges across the chasms of hatred and fear. If you found this story of transformation through education as fascinating as we did, please consider subscribing to our channel for more untold stories from history. Your subscription helps us continue bringing these remarkable human stories to light. If you're already part of our community, a like on this video really helps us reach more people who appreciate these deep dives into history's most extraordinary moments. And we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think education can truly transform enemies into allies? Have you encountered similar examples of redemption through learning in your own research or experience? Your engagement means everything to us and helps ensure we can keep exploring these powerful stories of human resilience and transformation. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode.